The black stallion only attacked men who moved too fast. Marcus Webb had followed every safety protocol perfectly, yet Tempest still launched himself at the corral fence with such violence that the wooden rails splintered. The horse's eyes weren't wild like most untamed animals. They were calculating, watching, as if he could sense something on certain people that triggered memories buried deep in his traumatized mind. Cassandra Rivera stood outside the corral, dust settling on her boots as she watched the latest horse trainer pack his equipment. 3 weeks since inheriting the ranch from her father, and the insurance company's ultimatum echoed in her mind. One more incident involving Tempest, and they would pull coverage entirely. 7 days to find a solution, or make the call that would haunt her forever. That makes 4 professionals, Marcus said, loading his rope into his pickup truck. Blood seeped through the bandage on his forearm where the stallion's hoof had caught him. I've been breaking horses for 15 years, Cass. This one's different. Her phone buzzed. Another text from her business partner asking about the Tempest situation. The black stallion had been rescued from a neglect case 6 months ago, bearing scars across his flanks that told stories she preferred not to imagine. Now he represented everything she stood to lose. From the barn came the familiar sound of Ezra Thorne's weathered boots on concrete, each step deliberate, measured, like a man walking through a minefield. He'd worked for her father for over a decade, handling maintenance with quiet efficiency. Never said much, but sometimes she caught him staring at nothing with eyes that held too much weight. Ezra appeared at her shoulder, studying Tempest, who now stood motionless in the center of the corral. The stallion's ears pinned back, nostrils flaring as he tracked every movement outside his enclosure. His massive frame trembled with barely contained energy. "That horse knows things," Ezra said quietly, his gravelly voice carrying an edge she'd never heard before. "Question is, what's he protecting himself from?" The way Ezra spoke made Cassandra's skin crawl. Like he understood something about Tempest that went deeper than animal behavior, something that connected to memories better left buried. Tempest suddenly wheeled toward them, his dark eyes locking onto Ezra through the fence rails. For a heartbeat, the two stared at each other in absolute silence. No fear, no aggression, just recognition passing between two beings who shared an invisible understanding. Then Tempest snorted and turned away, leaving them both wondering what had just happened. Marcus slammed his truck door, engine roaring to life. "Good luck, Cass, you're gonna need it." As the dust cloud from Marcus's departure settled, Cassandra realized that Ezra hadn't moved. He remained perfectly still, watching the stallion with an intensity that made her wonder if the quiet ranch hand knew something about broken things that she was only beginning to understand. By noon, half the county lined the corral fence to watch Jake Morrison attempt what 4 others had failed. Morrison's reputation had drawn spectators from 3 neighboring ranches, their pickup trucks forming a semicircle around the arena. Cold beer cans sweated in weathered hands despite the October chill. Side bets flew through the crowd as men leaned against tailgates, waiting for the show. Cassandra felt every pair of eyes weighing her judgment. These people had known her father for decades, trusted his methods. Now they watched his daughter gamble everything on one last desperate attempt to save a horse that most whispered should have been put down weeks ago. Morrison strutted into the corral with practiced confidence. His approach was textbook perfect. Slow movements, low voice, rope coiled loosely. He'd studied the previous failures and adjusted accordingly. But the moment his boots hit dirt, Tempest's entire demeanor shifted. The stallion circled the perimeter, muscles coiled like springs. Morrison crooned softly, taking measured steps forward. The crowd fell silent, sensing electric tension building in the confined space. Tempest wasn't looking at the rope or Morrison's hands. He stared directly into the man's eyes, reading something there that made his nostrils flare wide. The explosion came without warning. Tempest launched across the corral with terrifying fury, fence posts shuddering under the impact. Morrison dove sideways as 1,500 pounds of enraged horse slammed into the exact spot where he'd been standing. The crowd scattered, shouting warnings as Morrison scrambled toward the gate, his confidence evaporating into raw panic. While chaos erupted around them, Cassandra noticed something that made her blood freeze. Ezra Thorne hadn't moved. He stood completely still, hands relaxed at his sides, watching Tempest with unreadable calm. And the horse, still breathing hard from his attack, had turned to face Ezra through the fence rails. For just a moment, the two locked eyes in perfect silence. No fear, no aggression, pure recognition passing between beings who understood something the rest of them couldn't grasp. Morrison stumbled out of the corral, cursing and clutching his torn shirt. The spell broke, but Cassandra had seen enough. Whatever was happening between Ezra and that horse went deeper than anything she'd witnessed. "Nobody else will take this job now," Morrison panted, blood trickling from a scrape on his cheek. "That animal's a killer waiting to happen." The crowd began dispersing, their voices carrying disappointment and harsh judgments about stubborn horses and foolish decisions. But Ezra remained motionless, still watching Tempest with eyes that seemed to hold secrets darker than anyone suspected. Pickup trucks pulled away from the ranch, leaving tire tracks in the gravel and whispered judgments hanging in the air. Cassandra sat at her kitchen table, staring at the euthanasia papers her veterinarian had left behind. The insurance company's deadline loomed, 48 hours to find a miracle or lose everything her father had built. No other professional trainer would touch the job now. Word traveled fast in small towns, and Tempest's reputation had spread across 3 counties. The liability was too high, the risk too unpredictable. Ezra knocked on the back door just as shadows lengthened across the yard. His weathered face appeared through the screen, hat in his hands, but something in his posture had changed. The usual deference was gone, replaced by quiet determination. "Mind if I speak with you about that horse?" Cassandra gestured to the chair across from her. Ezra sat carefully, like a man whose body carried invisible injuries. She'd noticed how he favored his left leg during cold mornings, the way he sometimes paused mid-task and stared at distant horizons. "I know you think I'm just maintenance help," Ezra began, "but I've dealt with broken animals before. Different circumstances, but the principles are the same." "Where?" His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Military. We had working dogs overseas. Some came back destroyed, wouldn't respond to traditional methods. Command wanted them put down." The conviction in his voice caught her off guard. This wasn't the quiet background employee she thought she knew. This was someone who understood trauma from the inside out. "Tempest isn't just afraid," Ezra continued. "He's protecting himself from something specific. Those men who got hurt, they all carried themselves the same way. Aggressive body language, entitled energy. He's learned to identify threats. 5 professionals couldn't get near him, Ezra, because they tried to dominate him, break his will." Ezra's eyes met hers directly for the first time since her father's funeral. "That doesn't work with survivors." Outside, Tempest's hooves struck the corral fence in rhythmic precision, like a countdown timer marking the hours until his fate would be decided. "If you're wrong, I lose the ranch. And if I'm right, you save something everybody else gave up on." The weight in his voice made her realize this conversation wasn't just about the horse. There was something personal driving Ezra's offer, something connected to his own past that he wasn't ready to share. But time was running out, and desperate situations called for desperate measures. Sometimes the only person who could save the broken was someone who understood exactly how it felt to shatter. Dawn broke cold and clear as Ezra arrived at the corral carrying nothing but a thermos of coffee and a worn canvas stool. No ropes, no halter, no equipment of any kind. He positioned himself 20 feet from the fence and simply sat down, steam rising from his cup in the crisp air. Tempest stood frozen in the center of the corral, ears forward, processing this new variable. Every other human had entered his space armed with intentions and tools. This one brought only stillness. Neither moved for the first hour. Ezra sipped his coffee and watched the horizon brighten, occasionally glancing at the horse but never staring directly. It was the kind of patience that couldn't be taught, only earned through necessity. Cassandra approached quietly, gravel crunching under her boots. "Is something supposed to be happening?" "Everything's happening," Ezra replied without turning. "He's learning. I'm not a threat." As if responding to their voices, Tempest took 3 deliberate steps toward the fence. Not close enough to reach them, but closer than he'd been to any human since his rescue. His head remained high, muscles coiled for retreat, but curiosity was overriding caution. "In Vietnam, we had a dog named Charlie," Ezra said, voice barely above a whisper. IED took out his handler. For months afterward, Charlie would attack anyone who approached. Command wanted him destroyed. Tempest moved closer again, now only 10 feet from the fence. His breathing had shifted from shallow panting to something deeper, more controlled. "What changed?" Cassandra asked. "I sat with him. 3 weeks of just being there, proving I wasn't going anywhere." Ezra's voice carried the weight of old memories. When someone's been betrayed badly enough, trust becomes a luxury they can't afford. Tempest now stood directly at the fence, separated from them by only wooden rails. His dark eyes fixed on Ezra with startling intensity. Intelligence burned there, calculation, but also something that looked almost like recognition. "Animals read marks on your soul," Ezra said, slowly extending his hand toward the fence without quite touching it. "Trauma leaves scars that other survivors can sense." Tempest stretched his neck forward, nostrils flaring as he caught Ezra's scent. For a moment that seemed to stretch forever, horse and man regarded each other across the narrow space between damaged souls. Then Tempest's ears pinned back, and he retreated to the far corner of the corral, leaving them both wondering what memories had just surfaced in that charged moment of almost connection. The silence that followed felt heavier than the dawn air around them. The second day, Ezra brought a book, not to read, but to set beside his coffee cup on the wooden stool. Tempest watched from across the corral as the old ranch hand settled into position, his movements carrying the same deliberate calm as the morning before. But something had shifted overnight. The stallion's posture held less tension, more curiosity. "You're really just going to sit there again?" Cassandra asked, approaching with her own steaming mug. "Patience is a weapon," Ezra replied, his eyes never leaving Tempest. "In combat, the man who waits longest usually wins." Tempest began his slow approach earlier this time, covering the distance in measured steps that spoke of internal debate. Each movement forward was followed by a pause, as if he was testing invisible boundaries that only he could sense. Cassandra's phone rang, shattering the morning quiet. Her business partner's voice carried through the speaker, urgent and demanding updates about the insurance deadline. Tempest's head snapped toward the sound, ears pinned flat against his skull. The stallion backed away 3 steps, his breathing shallow and rapid. Ezra raised his hand slowly, a signal Cassandra had never seen before but understood instinctively. She ended the call immediately. "Loud voices trigger him," Ezra said quietly. "Reminds him of something he's trying to forget." The observation hit Cassandra like a physical blow. She thought about the shouting trainers, the aggressive commands, the frustrated curses that had filled the air during every failed attempt to break Tempest's spirit. "How do you know that?" "Because I recognize the signs." Ezra's voice carried a weight that made her stomach clench. "PTSD doesn't just happen to people." Tempest had stopped his retreat and was now studying them both with renewed intensity. His dark eyes moved between Cassandra's tense posture and Ezra's unshakable calm, as if comparing 2 different types of human energy. Slowly, Ezra reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew something that made Cassandra's breath catch. It was an apple, but he didn't offer it to the horse. Instead, he took a small bite, chewed thoughtfully, and set the fruit on the ground beside his stool. The gesture was simple, but its meaning was profound. No demands, no expectations, no attempts to lure or control. Just an offering freely given, with no strings attached. Tempest's nostrils flared as the scent of fresh apple reached him. He took 1 step forward, then another, his massive frame trembling with internal conflict between desire and self-preservation. "Don't look at him," Ezra whispered to Cassandra. "Direct eye contact feels like a challenge." She averted her gaze, focusing instead on the distant mountains, while Tempest crept closer to the fence. The sound of his hooves on packed earth seemed impossibly loud in the morning stillness. When she finally risked a glance, Tempest stood less than 5 feet from the fence, his neck stretched toward the apple that remained tantalizingly out of reach. But more importantly, he was breathing normally again, his ears forward in a position that spoke of interest rather than fear. Then a truck backfired on the county road, and Tempest bolted to the far side of the corral like he'd been struck by lightning. 24 hours remained until the insurance company's deadline when Ezra arrived at dawn, carrying something unexpected, a portable radio. He set it beside his stool and tuned it to a country music station, volume barely audible. Tempest's ears swiveled toward the sound, but instead of retreating, he remained in place, processing this new variable in his carefully controlled environment. "Music therapy," Ezra explained as Cassandra joined him. "We used it with combat dogs who'd developed noise sensitivity. Classical worked best, but Charlie liked Johnny Cash." The stallion began his approach ritual, but today something was different. His steps carried less hesitation, more purpose. The invisible barrier that had kept him at bay for weeks seemed to be weakening with each careful advance. "Tell me about Charlie," Cassandra said, settling onto the ground beside Ezra's stool. "Explosive detection dog, Saved more lives than I can count until the day an IED took out half his hearing and all his trust. Ezra's voice remained steady, but his hands tightened slightly around his coffee cup. Command said he was useless after that. Too unpredictable, too dangerous. Tempest had reached the fence line and was now testing the air, his nostrils working overtime to process the complex cocktail of scents that surrounded Ezra. But instead of focusing on the apple that lay forgotten from yesterday, the horse seemed more interested in the man himself. What happened to Charlie? 3 weeks of sitting together, just like this. No pressure, no expectations. On day 21, he finally let me touch his head. Ezra paused, memory flickering across his weathered features. Sometimes healing takes longer than we want, but it works if you're patient enough. Tempest stretched his massive neck through the fence rails, bringing his muzzle within inches of Ezra's outstretched hand. The horse's breath was warm and steady, no longer the rapid panting of constant anxiety. "Don't move," Ezra whispered. For 30 seconds, man and horse existed in perfect stillness. Tempest's dark eyes studied Ezra's face with startling intelligence, as if reading the map of old scars that time and trauma had etched into his features. This wasn't the random curiosity of an animal. This was conscious evaluation by a survivor recognizing another survivor. Then Tempest did something that made Cassandra's heart skip. He lowered his head and gently touched Ezra's palm with his muzzle. Not a bite, not a strike, but the softest possible contact between two damaged beings who had finally found a common language. "Jesus," Cassandra breathed. The moment shattered as her phone buzzed with an incoming call. Tempest jerked back but didn't bolt this time. Instead, he remained at the fence, watching Ezra with eyes that held something resembling hope. The caller ID displayed her veterinarian's number. Doctor. Martinez never called unless it was urgent, and with the deadline looming, Cassandra knew exactly what this conversation would be about. "I have to take this," she whispered to Ezra. As she answered the phone, walking toward the house to avoid disturbing the fragile connection that had just formed, she heard Dr. Martinez's familiar voice delivering the news she'd been dreading. Someone had reported Tempest's incidents to the State Animal Control Board. An inspector would arrive tomorrow morning to evaluate whether the stallion posed a public safety risk. The deadline had just moved up by 24 hours. Inspector Helen Rodriguez arrived at 8 sharp the following morning. Her clipboard and camera ready to document what everyone expected would be Tempest's final evaluation. Ezra had spent the previous afternoon preparing for this moment, working with Tempest in extended sessions that built on their growing foundation of trust. Word had spread through the county overnight. The black stallion who'd terrorized 5 professional trainers was finally going to meet his match with state bureaucracy. The small crowd that gathered along the fence included several neighbors who'd come to witness the inevitable. Cassandra felt sick as she watched Rodriguez set up her equipment. The inspector's cold efficiency reminded her of military personnel, all protocol and procedures with no room for sentiment. Behind the corral fence, Tempest paced restlessly, sensing the tension that crackled through the morning air like electricity before a storm. "I need to see this animal's behavior under controlled conditions," Rodriguez announced, pulling on thick leather gloves. "Standard approach protocols will determine his threat level." Ezra stepped forward from his position by the fence. "Ma'am, I'd like to request permission to demonstrate an alternative method first." Rodriguez looked him up and down, taking in his worn clothes and weathered face with obvious skepticism. "Are you a licensed trainer, sir?" "No, ma'am, but I'm the man who's been working with this horse for the past 3 days. The crowd murmured with surprise. Most had assumed Ezra was just another ranch hand, invisible background help that nobody paid attention to. But something in his bearing had changed. The quiet deference was gone, replaced by the unmistakable presence of someone accustomed to command under pressure. 3 days? Rodriguez consulted her clipboard. "My report shows this animal has injured 5 professional trainers in the past month." "Yes, ma'am. Those men used dominance-based techniques that triggered his defensive responses." Ezra's voice carried the measured cadence of someone giving a military briefing. "I've been applying trauma-informed methods developed for combat animals with post-traumatic stress." The inspector's eyebrows rose slightly. "You're claiming this horse has PTSD?" "I'm stating that animals rescued from severe abuse exhibit behavioral patterns consistent with trauma responses. Standard breaking techniques fail because they recreate the conditions that caused the original damage." Tempest had stopped pacing and was now watching Ezra with laser focus. The stallion's ears were forward, his breathing steady despite the crowd's presence. It was the first time anyone had seen him remain calm with this many people around. Ezra walked slowly toward the corral gate, his movements carrying the same deliberate patience he'd shown during their morning sessions. "Permission to enter, Inspector?" Rodriguez hesitated, her pen hovering over her evaluation form. Protocol demanded she follow standard procedures, but the horse's obvious comfort with this particular man complicated her assessment. "If that animal attacks you, sir, I cannot be held responsible." "Understood, ma'am." Ezra opened the gate and stepped into the corral with Tempest for the first time. The crowd fell silent, waiting for the explosion of violence they'd witnessed so many times before. But Tempest simply stood there, muscles relaxed, watching Ezra approach with what could only be described as recognition. Then Ezra began to speak, his voice pitched low and steady, carrying words that made the inspector's clipboard forgotten in her hands and turned the morning into something nobody had expected to witness. Ezra's voice carried across the corral with quiet authority, speaking words that transformed the entire scene. "Easy, Tempest. Command presence, steady breathing, no sudden movements." But he wasn't just talking to the horse. He was narrating his own actions, creating a verbal rhythm that Tempest could predict and trust. The stallion stepped forward without hesitation, closing the distance between them until he stood within arm's reach of the man who'd spent 3 days earning his confidence. Ezra raised his hand slowly, palm open, letting Tempest investigate his scent one more time before making contact. "Positive reinforcement protocol," Ezra continued, his voice never changing pitch or tempo. "No force, no dominance displays, no punishment-based conditioning. Just consistent, predictable behavior that builds neural pathways of safety instead of fear." Inspector Rodriguez watched in stunned silence as Ezra placed his palm flat against Tempest's neck. The stallion's skin quivered slightly at the contact, but he didn't retreat. Instead, he leaned into the touch, a gesture of trust that made several onlookers gasp in disbelief. "In Vietnam, we learned that broken spirits can't be fixed with more breaking," Ezra said, stroking Tempest's neck with gentle, methodical movements. "You have to rebuild trust one moment at a time, proving over and over that you're different from the people who caused the damage." With slow deliberation, Ezra produced a simple rope halter from his back pocket, not the heavy leather equipment that previous trainers had brandished like weapons, but a soft cotton rope that looked more like a suggestion than a demand. Tempest's eyes tracked the halter, but his breathing remained steady. "The secret isn't controlling the animal," Ezra explained as he held the halter where Tempest could see it clearly. "It's helping the animal choose to trust you with their vulnerability." He brought the halter up slowly, giving Tempest every opportunity to refuse or retreat. But the stallion held steady, allowing Ezra to slip the rope gently over his ears and around his muzzle. For the first time since his rescue, Tempest wore human restraints without resistance. The crowd erupted in whispers and scattered applause, but Ezra wasn't finished. He clipped a lead rope to the halter and took one step backward, applying the slightest pressure. Tempest hesitated for only a moment before taking a step forward, following Ezra's guidance. Inspector Rodriguez dropped her clipboard entirely as Ezra led Tempest in a slow circle around the corral. The massive stallion moved with calm precision, responding to subtle cues from a man who understood that some wounds could only be healed by someone who carried similar scars. "Evaluation complete," Rodriguez announced, her voice thick with amazement. "This animal shows no signs of aggressive behavior and responds appropriately to trained handling." 3 months later, Tempest worked as a reliable trail horse on the ranch, carrying experienced riders through mountain paths with steady patience. The stallion who'd once attacked trainers now responded calmly to gentle guidance, living proof that trauma could be healed with the right approach and enough time. And sometimes, late in the evening when work was done, Cassandra would find Ezra and Tempest standing together in the pasture, 2 old warriors who'd discovered that understanding each other's pain was the first step toward letting it go. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable Western tale where courage meets destiny in unexpected ways. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.